Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kay Jacobson. I am the History and Current Events Coordinator for the Ramsey County Libraries, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to Wednesday with a Scholar. Um, our partnership here with OLLI, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, and the library helps provide funds so that we can provide this programming for you. And I just want to talk a little bit about our speaker today. I'm excited. She is Angie Hong. She is she's been a conservation educator for more than 20 years, and she's a coordinator for the Minnesota's East Metro Water Education Program. She works with local government partners and to implement education programs focused on teaching and inspiring communities to protect water resources. Her tips and tales about keeping water clean are featured regularly in columns in local papers such as the Stillwater Gazette, Forest Lake Times, and other Minnesota newspapers, as well as on the online site eastmetrowater.org. Don't worry, I'll put that in chat. You guys will get to see that later. Also, I'll put in her Instagram and TikTok things in case you want to connect there also. She's currently written a book that's out called Exploring the St. Croix River Valley, Adventures on and Off the Water. And that's mainly what she's going to be speaking about today. We do have these at the library. It's also available through the University of Minnesota Press. So many ways to get a hold of this book. And without any further ado, let's hand things over to Angie.
Thank you, Kay. And hi, everyone. I'm so sad that I can't actually see all of your faces. I just kind of scrolled through the names to see if there were people who I recognized in the crowd. And if we were there in person, then I could wave and say hello to you. Let me start sharing my screen. So we'll just get that out of the way right away. And there we go. Everybody should be able to see now. So I'm going to be talking today about the St. Croix River and both my own story of my connection with the river, but also the many different ways that you can tell the story of the river itself. And just kind of a note about myself. So in many, many of these adventures, you will notice that my son, Charlie, who is pictured here, features prominently, as does dog Molly. Charlie was little when this photo was taken, and now he's 13 years old and seems to be about 5 or 6 inches taller than me. But I have, as Kay said, let me just make sure I'm getting my slides to advance correctly here. There we go. Oop. All right. As Kay said, I've been working in the St. Croix region for almost 20 years now. And for the first 5 years that I was working here, I was actually living in Savage and commuting an 2 hours round trip to and from work every day. And so while I was really gaining an appreciation for the area and the different conservation organizations that are working out here, it wasn't until I moved to Stillwater and became a Valley resident myself that I really started falling in love with the St. Croix River. And just coincidentally, I happened to be pregnant with Charlie at the time that I was moving here in 2011. And so after we landed here, I very quickly set to work to really get to know my new home and the surroundings and all those places that people are always telling you about. Have you ever seen that park? Have you ever gone to that trail? Have you ever checked out this part of the river? I kind of like took it as my mission to really, really get to know the area. And as I was doing that, I was very often doing it on a day off of work or on the weekend with, Charlie in the backpack and then Charlie the toddler in tow and then Charlie the slightly bigger kid nearby. And so it came to be that I am now in this place where I'm no longer really able to distinguish between work life Angie and personal life Angie. It just kind of all got, intertangled in, growing through life and raising a kid and working really hard to protect and restore the prairies and the woods and the forests and the lakes and the rivers out here. So that's kind of my story, the connection to the river. But I want to take you back in time 2 years ago to 2022. February of 2022, in fact. Actually, that's 3 years ago. Isn't it crazy how time flies? So 3 years ago, February of 2022, and it was cold and wintry, much like it is today. For years, I have been writing articles for the local newspapers, and people would often say, "Hey, Angie, I really enjoy reading these articles. Have you ever considered writing a book?" And the answer was no. And no, I hadn't considered writing a book. And also, where on earth would I find the time to do something like that? But in the wake of COVID, I think it created just enough, slowdown that I was able to be creative. And I decided to take a week off of work and I rented myself a VRBO cabin in the middle of just absolute nowhere up in Pine County. It was near Changotana State Forest. And it's very likely that you've never been there because there really, really is nothing at Changotana State Forest. It's truly the middle of nowhere. But if you go, you might meet my friend, the muskrat. So I took a week off of work and I brought along with me all of the supplies that I thought that a aspiring writer might need. So I had everything to take me from the morning through the midday into the evening. I had my computer along and the dog, Molly, got to come along, and my husband and son got left at home. And I tried to just shut out work and, see what I could get done. So obviously, I didn't write a book in a week. That would be pretty wild. But I did get a good enough start to have an outline and some sample sections that at the end of the week that I sent it over to University of Minnesota Press, and then gave them my first draft at the end of October. So that was about 6 months for anybody who is, kind of curious about the writing process. 6 months that it took me from, the beginning of writing to the end of writing. However, so that was the end of October of 2022. It was fully until July of 2024 before we had a book. So I learned in this process that there's just so many steps in writing a book, so much more than just the writing part, so much involved in the graphic design and the layout and the arranging of the photos and the early readers and the editing and the pre-press and all of this kind of stuff. But it came out in July, and so it has been a lot of fun sharing about the St. Croix River with groups like this. And that is my story about the St. Croix River. But this is the part where I really wish that you were all in a room so people could be shouting out answers to me. I'm showing, I don't actually know if you have your screen on that you can see me talking, or if you're just seeing this little cartoon photo of a glass of water, but I'm showing a glass of water because there's an obvious place you could think of first if you're thinking of the story of the St. Croix River, and that would be with the water. So if we step back in time even longer ago, not just February 2022, but step back in time maybe to 14,000 years ago, this entire region of North America was underneath an ice sheet during the last ice age. And as those glaciers eventually retreated, starting 10,000 years ago, they left behind a lot of water. So we have all of these prairie potholes, which eventually filled with water and became lakes and wetlands. We've got rivulets of streams that lead to the St. Croix River. And we've got groundwater, which eventually sank in and formed the aquifers, where probably most of the people, depending on if you live in St. Paul, I guess you might be getting Mississippi water. But if you're in the St. Croix region, pretty much everybody is getting their drinking water from the groundwater. So if you're looking at this map, this kind of green shaded region is the entire watershed for the St. Croix River, and it kind of looks like the shape of Africa. But this is all the place where the land is flowing and going into wetlands and streams and lakes, which eventually connect to the river. And what is kind of interesting, if you look where my cursor is, right up here is where the St. Croix River starts. It is in Solon Springs, Wisconsin. And there's a huge wetland complex here. And from the top of the wetland complex, the water actually flows north. There's a smaller river called the Boise Brule, and it actually flows north up to Lake Superior. And then from the south end of the wetland complex, the water flows south. It becomes the St. Croix, goes all the way down, connects with the Mississippi and Prescott, and then all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. So I just think it's really cool that there's, this one wetland that flows in two different directions, and one is such a short trip and one is such a long one. But during the fur trading time, there's like an historic portage here. So there's like a little 2-mile gap between the north end of the wetland and the south end of the wetland. And people would come down in their canoes through the Great Lakes and then hike that little stretch and then be able to get onto the river to connect to all of the other rivers. So the water is an obvious way that we can tell the story of the St. Croix, but there's a lot of other interesting components to the St. Croix. So, you know, am I able to see the chat? Are people, if I turn on the chat, are people able to type in the chat, or is it just me that's able to?
So attendees are able to type into the chat and interact with you as a panelist.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so I want guesses. I want anybody to guess why I'm holding up an iPhone cord and how this relates to the St. Croix River. I'm not seeing any guesses. There's got to be somebody guessing. No clue. People lose them. Okay. I'm gonna try to give you a clue here. If you go to Stillwater, you will find a quaint and charming town, but you will also find this enormous power plant, the Allen S. King power plant. It is one of the only 2 coal-burning power plants that is left in Minnesota, and it plays a really pivotal role in the story of the St. Croix River. So back in the 1960s, it was proposed that this power plant would get built. And at the time, Xcel Energy was called Northern States Power. Understandably, a lot of people were really opposed to this idea. Remember that this was the time before most of our modern environmental policy was established. We've got the Cuyahoga River in Ohio that was catching on fire. We've got massive water and air pollution problems all around the US. And here's this beautiful river and these quaint little towns and a proposal to build a giant coal burning power plant. So people in the communities on both sides of the river organized and advocated and tried really hard to block this power plant from getting built. And they lobbied to Walter Mondale, who was a Minnesota senator at the time, and to Gaylord Nelson, who was a Wisconsin state senator at the time. And the 2 of them got very involved. And they fought really hard at the Senate level in the US government to block it. And as you can see, there's a photo here. So obviously they failed. And this is kind of one of these stories I like to share of how the future doesn't go in a straight line. The future takes a curving path sometimes that's hard to predict what the end result will be. Because while they were successful in getting this power plant built, one of the one of the agreements for getting the power plant built was that they established a Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, which is federal legislation. And this was passed in 1968, and 7 rivers were in the original legislation. The St. Croix River was one of them. So it has now expanded to include a couple hundred rivers across the country. And this entire piece of legislation, the whole Wild and Scenic Rivers program, wouldn't exist if it weren't for the fact that the coal burning power plant got built. But more so than just that, Northern States Power also owned vast tracts of land along the St. Croix River north of Stillwater up by the Taylor's Falls region. And so they also agreed to donate a lot of their land to the state of Minnesota, to the state of Wisconsin, and to the federal government. So if you go up to Wild River State Park and you're enjoying, this beautiful natural forest experience in the St. Croix River, this is land that was formerly owned by the power company and wouldn't have been set aside for protection and for recreation if it weren't for that power plant getting built. And if you cross the river and you are over at Governor Noel's State Forest, this is one of those kind of long, skinny style parks. It's got hiking trails and equestrian trails and campgrounds along the river. This is another chunk of land that was originally owned by Northern States Power. Likewise, if you go to the National Park Service Visitor Center, which is in St. Croix Falls, that was also on land owned by the Park Service, owned by the power company. So we got a Wild and Scenic Rivers Act out of the deal. We got additional public lands out of the deal. And one last thing is that that coal burning power plant is actually set to be decommissioned in 2028. So the circle of, kind of how the future progressed continues going, and it's part of Excel's initiative to be coal free by 2028 and to transition to having renewable energy. So because the St. Croix River is a wild and scenic river, it enjoys a lot of protections that other rivers don't. There's no development allowed close to the shoreline. There's no new bridges and no new dams allowed to be built. And the idea is that when you're on the river, you should be able to have a natural wilderness experience. And also that we're protecting that wildlife corridor for the birds and the other animals that live in the area. So I like to tell people, if you're fond of places like the Boundary Waters, you can have a wilderness experience on the St. Croix a lot closer to home, and a lot more wild than I think people realize. If you asked me to tell you my very favorite stretch of the St. Croix River, and you, as long as you're in a chatty chat mood and typing things in the chat, you can feel free to tell me your favorite stretch of the river. But my favorite stretch that I go to time and time again is from the log cabin landing in Scandia down to William O'Brien State Park. And it's this short little stretch that's actually only about 2 miles long. If you were to get on the river and just go straight down, it would hardly take you any time at all. But what I actually like to do is get on the river here, and then I go into these backwater channels, because as soon as, let me get my little click going here. As soon as you get into the backwater channels, it's like you're in the time that land, or the land that time forgot. You can be out there without seeing other people. You are seeing lots of wildlife. There is, just a really peaceful experience. The confluence where it joins the Mississippi River, that's a pretty cool place along there too. And it is changing constantly throughout the seasons, from one year to the next, so much so that it is able to hold our interest, my interest, and my son's interest back from when he was a little guy all the way up until now, when he's a not so little guy anymore. When he was young, I had this brilliant and terrifying idea one day. Like, what if I have a stand-up paddleboard? And I thought, what if I took him and the dog, and we all three of us tried to balance on the stand-up paddleboard? Would we be able to do it? Either be the best idea or the worst idea in the world. And luckily for all of us, we stayed afloat. We got on the paddleboard and it worked. And that became a new, really fun way for us to get out on the river. Because what I would do is I would drop off my bike down here at William O'Brien State Park, and then we would drive up and we would kind of, spend the day getting our ways back down here. And then there's a nice bike trail that just goes right through the park until you get here. And then you're on a gravel road all the way back to the boat launch again. And so that way I could do it all by myself without having to have a truck or another car to shuttle me or anybody to come pick me up. And as Charlie got older, then he started floating his own boat, and we started bringing 2 bikes along instead of just one. But it's been just a really great getaway. And like I said, it's just right next to Scandia and Marina and St. Croix. You get out there and you would think you were in the middle of nowhere, because it really truly is like that. But if you explore the upper river, you get up north of Taylor's Falls and St. Croix Falls, it truly becomes a wilderness. You cannot hear it in this photo because it's a photo, but there were coyotes howling while I was taking this photo one morning off the Riverside landing along the St. Croix River. And there's a lot of stretches of the river up there where it can be 10 miles between a place where you put on and where you take off. There's a lot of public lands on both sides of the river. And so you really do have to plan ahead, much like you would if you were going to the Boundary Waters, to, bring everything you think you're going to need. You're not going to have cell phone reception. But I've been out there for days and hardly seen other people at all, maybe one person a day while I've been out on the river. I did want to be able to give you a little taste of what it's like on some parts of the St. Croix Riverway. I mentioned that it's part of the Wild and Scenic River system. And so the St. Croix River, basically north of Stillwater, and then all of the Namakagon River, which is the largest tributary to the St. Croix, those are all part of the national park system. And it's the St. Croix National Scenic Riverway. The Namakagon is an absolutely beautiful river. It starts near Cable, Wisconsin. And this is the part where I've got a few video clips just to give you a taste for what it's like out there on the river. Here's what we did. We dropped off the bike at Whispering Pines Landing, and then we put in the canoe at County Road K. It's a 10-mile ride, and that took us a little over 5.5 hours. We stopped for a long lunch and also for a long swim along the way. Day 2, we are getting on the river where we left off at Whispering Pines, and we're gonna go down to McDowell Landing. Today's river is totally different than yesterday's. The water is smooth and flat everywhere we go. And then we found this little spring-fed stream. The water's super cold right where we're standing. And then as soon as you walk down to the river where Gary's standing, it's warm. It's pretty cool. Okay, not gonna make you watch the entire 5-minute video, but, oh dear, I was gonna try to make you watch it again. What I do wanna tell you is that the St. Croix River is actually very easy to explore by canoe camping. There are campsites all along the Namakagon and all along the St. Croix, and they are free. It's just first come, first serve canoeing campsites. If you're camping in one of the sites that's lower than Highway 8, then you need a free permit. But above Highway 8, it's basically you just get on a boat and you show up at one of these campsites and you can camp for the night. So it makes it easy to be able to have an experience with minimal, permit planning, that kind of stuff, and you can do it really inexpensively. I'm kind of hardcore, so I like to use the bicycle to do the shuttling, and what I'll do is drop off the bike, and then we'll canoe down, and I'll pick up, get on the bike and ride back and pick up our car and catch it up to us at the end of the day. So we've been able to do multi-day trips like that where I'm just kind of leapfrogging and catching the car up to us every day. But there are a lot of outfitters that will rent canoes and kayaks or shuttle you if you want to do a multi-day thing, and they can pick you up at the end and drive you back to the beginning. So very cool and unique experience that you can have, and a lot closer than going all the way north to the Boundary Waters. It's only about an hour and a half away from the Twin Cities area. All right, so we've come to another part in the St. Croix River story, and it has to do with this pine cone. People are still making guesses. You can make a guess. But it would be very hard to talk about the St. Croix River without talking about the history of logging in the region, because that is really how the town of Stillwater came to be and how European Americans came to settle this area in the first place. When the timber companies first came in and started logging Minnesota and Wisconsin, they would float the logs down the tributaries and down the St. Croix, and then pick them up at places in Osceola, Marina, and St. Croix, Stillwater, to be turned into lumber to build houses and buildings. And so even though we have a lot of forests in the St. Croix watershed today, when you're looking around at these forests, they're all second growth. We don't have, for the most part, we don't have old growth forests anymore in our region. And in a lot of places, the forests are transitioning from like an oak woodland. For example, in this photo, this used to be an oak woodland that is slowly filling in with maples and aspen trees. It's the natural kind of transition that happens in areas that used to be fire dependent systems and don't have fire anymore. But there are a lot of forests, and I always find it hopeful that the forests are able to regrow even when they've been so severely impacted. If you're into big trees though, and I think everybody is, you can find a couple remnants where there are old growth trees still. So if you were to go up to Osprey Wilds Environmental Learning Center in Sandstone, you can find some of the old growth white pine trees right on the south side of Grindstone Lake. And if you went to Fairyland State Recreation Area in Wisconsin on Lake Namakagon, there are some old growth hemlock trees there. So there's a couple places where you can go to find the big trees. But in my book, I try to, feature different kinds of forests and different kind of forest experiences that you can have throughout the watershed. So it's going to be a different kind of forest in the southern than it will be in the northern, where you start to get into those conifers and into the red pines and the white pines. And I thought that this would be a good place for me to pause the talking and instead read you a little excerpt from the book. This is from the intro to the forests and woods section of the book. They say that trees can speak to each other in a language we humans are too busy to hear and too self-absorbed to understand. Peter Wollben, a German forester who wrote the now famous book, The Hidden Life of Trees, What They Feel, How They Communicate, has learned that trees in a forest actually live as a community. They maintain interdependent relationships and share water and nutrients through underground fungal networks. They send distress signals about drought and disease through chemical, hormonal, and slow pulsing electrical signals, and can also communicate through the air by releasing pheromones and other scents. While traveling in New Zealand in 2016, my family and I visited the largest living quarry tree, a 2,000-year-old giant known locally as Tane Mahuta, Lord of the Forest. Over the 2,000 years, the Tane Mahuta has grown ever so slightly from a tiny seed into a behemoth tree 169 feet tall. The world has experienced the rise of Christianity, the fall of the Roman Empire, Western colonization of the Americas, Africa, and Australia, an industrial revolution, 2 world wars, and countless other changes. Does Tane Mahuta sense the enormity of change that has happened in its lifetime? Did it feel a mounting sense of loss as its community of quarry were slowly down for timber? As every year the chatter in the forest grew a little bit softer? I wonder too about the solitary trees planted in city yards and rolling farm fields. Did they feel the same loneliness of modern society that plagues so many of us? Did they long for a community of their own with which to share signals and sustenance? Maybe the tree in your yard could use a couple of friends. Okay, so we're moving on from the forest to a new biome. And I just feel terribly sad that I can't hold this up to the camera for you to be able to smell it, because if you could smell it, you would probably agree with me that it smells like black licorice. This is anise hyssop, and it is one of the plants that grows in the prairies. And something that makes prairie plants really cool is that they have these incredibly long roots. So if you can see the screen and me, I've got this long blue ribbon that I'm slowly unfurling. Prairie plants might be 5 or 8 feet tall above ground and then have roots that go down 10 or 15 feet deep. And so because of that, prairies were able to withstand a lot of really dramatic changes in the climate, having cold winters, having drought, having fires come through, because the plant above ground dies while the roots below ground stay alive. And in Minnesota, about 1/3 of our landscape was once prairie. In the St. Croix watershed, you find prairie down in the southernmost portion of the watershed. And then when you get up in the north, kind of in the northwestern Wisconsin area, there's actually a globally rare kind of habitat called the pine barrens. And the pine barrens, the best way I can describe them is like a prairie with little miniature pine trees growing in it. And needless to say, we've lost most of our prairies. Most of the prairies are those places that got turned under to become farm fields and developed areas. We've got less than 2% of prairies remaining anywhere in the country, including in the state of Minnesota. And so if you go out and you visit one of these places, you're usually finding a little tiny remnant of prairie surrounded by a larger area where people have been working to restore the land. Put the prairie, bring the prairie plants back again that once grew in those locations. This beautiful cut plant with the monarch butterfly on it was at Kelly Creek Preserve, which is just northeast of River Falls, and it's part of the Kinnickinnic River Land Trust area that's protected land to protect the watershed around the Kinnickinnic River. So just some of the cool prairie experiences that I'd like to recommend. One very close to the Twin Cities is if you head out to the Bellwin Conservancy. They're a nonprofit organization located in Afton, Minnesota. They've got about 1,500 acres of land and have been doing prairie and oak savanna restoration since the late 70s. So while it is restored prairie, it's very high quality restored prairie in most locations. And kind of their claim to fame is that they now have a seasonal bison herd. So if you go out in early June, they have a bison festival and the bison come running off the truck into the prairie. There's food, there's music, there's activities. It's a really great way to connect with the land. But the Stagecoach Prairie Trails are open to the public year round, so you can go hiking there at any time also. Not the part where the bison are. You go hiking in a different part where the bison aren't. But if you're into bison, you can also go over to the Fish Creek Nature Trails at Cedar Creek Ecosystem Science Reserve in East Bethel, and they have a year-round bison herd there. When I went, I wasn't able to see them, but we did find this little creature here that you can see my son is holding in his hands. It's a little tiny lizard called a skink, a prairie skink. And we actually have 3 kinds of lizards that live in Minnesota. There is a prairie skink, 5-line skink, and a 6-line race runner. But I had never seen one before, although I knew that they existed, and actually found this one in the outhouse of all places. So that was a fun find, but they live in prairies, and it, is something that you can keep your eye out for. My absolute favorite place to kind of my personal favorite prairie is at Standing Cedars Community Land Conservancy. It's near Osceola, Wisconsin, a little south of Osceola. And they've actually got 4 separate non-contiguous parcels of land. And you could go, you can see the prairie. On one of them, on the Buffalo Skull Track, there's this beautiful spring-fed stream that goes through the land. And it's kind of like getting to have a state park all to yourself is the best way I could describe it. It's managed by a nonprofit organization. It's public land, open to everybody, but it's not improved. So you won't find bathrooms in a nice parking lot and things like that, but really beautiful land. And I spent a lot of time there during COVID. And so I've come to kind of think of it as being my own. Exciting news though, in Northern Washington County in May Township, there is just over 2,000 acres of land that was formerly managed as a cattle farm and is now going to be permanently protected and restored as a grassland. So Kelly Farms, this whole deal went through about a year and a half ago. And the land that is on the west side of Manning Avenue, as you're heading north towards Big Marine Regional Park, has been added on, or it's become a Minnesota DNR wildlife management area. And then the land that is on the east side of the road is getting added on to Big Marine Regional Park. And in a lot of places, the land actually doesn't need that much work to get it. It wasn't turned under for intensive farming. So a lot of places, it doesn't need that much work to get back to high quality habitat. But on the Big Marine Park side, Pollinator Friendly Alliance and Washington County Parks are going to be doing some restoration, taking 25 acres of corn and turning it into prairie in the coming year. So then I thought it would be worthwhile to talk about wetlands because people always forget about wetlands. We know about the lakes, we know about the rivers, and I will mention them at the end because we've got some pretty nice success stories. But we've got a whole lot of land that is neither wet nor dry. We've got a whole lot of wetlands throughout the watershed. And they're, I would describe, not as easy to visit, but very, very important to the health of the watershed and for the wildlife that live here. I had a really awesome experience while I was writing the book that just serendipitously, this young man, Giwaden Indiznikaz, reached out to me, and he and I had actually never met each other before. At the time, he was a student at University of Minnesota Duluth. He's from the Leech Lake Reservation up in northern Minnesota, and he makes videos for TikTok, and I make videos for TikTok. And so one day he sent me a message and he said, "Hey, Angie, would you like to come up north this fall and come wild racing with a group of us?" And I, of course, said yes, because why wouldn't I say yes to an opportunity like that? So there was a large group of us, and people from all around the world, actually, not just in Minnesota, but we went out in canoes and they taught us the traditional Anishinaabe way of harvesting wild rice. And if you've never done it before, you're sitting in canoe and you go through these stands of wild rice, and wild rice is actually just a grass. It's an aquatic grass that grows in wetlands and on the edges of lakes and rivers. And you have these wooden knockers, and you're basically just going bop, 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 and you're just bopping the grass as you go by so that the seeds are falling into your boat. And who to connect about wild ricing at Leech? Yeah, I do not know who. So where we went wild ricing was actually on the Moosehorn River, which is by Moose Lake. So it's not on reservation land. It's a location where anybody could go wild ricing with a permit from the DNR. This was the Water Protectors were the group that was organizing the wild ricing. And so I don't know that they have it. It's not really like open to the public as like a, hey, come and join us thing, but they are certainly a good group of people to support for their work in the watershed. So when you get all these seeds, they go into your canoe, and I'll see, let me just click here to make sure. It looks like this. It looks like just all these little grass seeds. And then it takes an awful lot more work, days worth of work or so, to get the husk off of the seeds and to roast them and turn them into the, what we know as wild rice. What I thought was really cool as we're out doing this canoeing, there's the very like European American mindset of like, I need to be efficient. And then there's an alternative mindset, which Giwaden was encouraging us all to adopt. He said, if you're going by in your canoe and you're getting frustrated because you're hitting the grass and only half of it's falling into your canoe and the other half's falling in the water, that's okay. Because wild rice is actually an annual plant. And so if there aren't seeds falling into the water, there's no wild rice next year. And there's all these other animals that also need the wild rice. So I'm backing up just to show you this photo with the birds flying. There was birds everywhere, and the wild rice was just filled with insects. So it's a very immersive experience. You're in there and there's like spiders and little, inchworms and insects everywhere. And the birds are swooping down to eat these bugs as you're collecting. But Giwaden was like, don't worry, like you're collecting enough for yourself, and it's okay to also leave the wild rice for everybody else who needs it and for next year's stand as well. So that was a very intense, immersive experience in the wetlands, but there are some kind of lower key wetland experiences that I would recommend. If you go up to Croix Meadows in Grantsburg, Wisconsin, it is an absolutely fabulous place to see sandhill cranes migrating through in the spring and in the fall. And they come through in the thousands. Just flocks and flocks of sandhill cranes. There's huge prairie and wetland complexes throughout the area. And this is in that area where there are the pine barrens that I was mentioning before. But even closer to home, for all of us here in the Twin Cities, did you know that the southernmost tamarack swamp in the state of Minnesota is located in Woodbury? So if you go to the Tamarack Nature Preserve in Woodbury, you can walk on this nice boardwalk. It's wide enough that you can take a wheelchair or a stroller on it, very sturdy. And you can go through this tamarack swamp and you can be able to see the tamarack trees, which are really unique because they're a conifer, but their needles change colors and fall off, unlike other conifers. And you can find all sorts of really cool wetland plants, like these big fat green leaves are from a marsh calla lily, and it gets little white flowers that will come up in like late May, early June kind of time. So a cool wetland experience. The first place, oh yes, Croix Meadow. Croix Meadow. It is in Grantsburg, Wisconsin. Okay, so I thought that it would be worthy to highlight some conservation success stories from the region, because we actually have a lot to share. And I know there's a lot of, potentially scary news that's happening right now. And, we tend to focus on the bad a lot, but there's plenty of good things that are also happening. And so thinking about streams and rivers, first of all, there has been a movement over the past 50 years to take down a lot of historic dams and rewild rivers. So if you look at this beautiful waterfall right here, this is from Willow River State Park, which is, let's see, Willow River State Park is this one, number 2 on the map. And it is located a little ways outside of Hudson. It's one of those kind of waterfalls like along the North Shore, where if you go there during the summer, it's just filled with people. Everybody's wading in the water. You can actually go behind the waterfall. But there was previously actually 2 dams on the Willow River that were removed in the 90s and then in the early 2000s that restored that waterfall. There have been dams removed on the Minnesota side of the river, on the Kettle River, on the Minnesota Willow River, and planned to be removed on the Grindstone River. And then over in River Falls, there's 2 dams that there are plans underway. The city's working with U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to take those dams out as well. So statewide, Minnesota DNR, I just wrote about this, and I want to say it's like 50 dams that have come down over the past couple of decades. So that's one really big positive trend that we're seeing, is reconnecting habitat for fish. And in a lot of these places, all it takes is taking down the dam and the fish are able to migrate back to their spawning grounds on their own. They don't have to be reintroduced. Just to mention it, this is obviously not the St. Croix River, but the Mississippi River. And since I know a lot of you are probably tuning in from St. Paul, there are discussions underway to consider removing the Lower St. Anthony Falls Lock and Dam and Lock and Dam number 2, the Ford Dam. And right now, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is doing dispositional studies to, see what the pros and cons of this would be, both environmentally and financially. But what I am showing you is artist rendering of what it would look like if that Lock and Dam number 2 were to come out, or the Lower St. Anthony Falls Lock and Dam were to come out, or if the Ford Dam were to come out. This is obviously not something that would happen in the near future, but it is something that could happen 10 years from now and would restore that stretch of the Mississippi River to a much more natural, free-flowing state as well. So that's something just to keep your eyes on. And I think it's about a year out before the Army Corps is going to release the results of their study with the recommendations, and then everybody can decide what to do with that next. So there's some big changes happening to the rivers, but in the little streams, there's also been a lot of work to remeander streams that were artificially ditched over the years. And so in a lot of places, you find these little streams that when people started farming in the area, or they developed the area, they made a wiggly stream straight. And we've got a lot of really great examples. This one is from Afton State Park, where they took what used to be a relatively straight stream bed, and they created a new meandering stream with a floodplain around it. And this was completed by the South Washington Watershed District in partnership with the DNR and Great River Greening. And they were actually able to release 2,500 little fingerling heritage trout into the stream just last October. They've been spending about 15 years working to restore water quality and get it back to a place where it could support fish again, and finally felt like they had reached that point just as of October. So that's an exciting project. In Stillwater, there is a very similar project happening along the Browns Creek, where they are doing a remeander and floodplain recreation. And you can see that from the Browns Creek State Trail. And they are planning on releasing trout into the stream in the fall. So it's probably going to be September or October. All right. And not yet happening, but in the future, there will likely be a stream restoration project happening in Marina and St. Croix between Highway 95 and the Brookside Bar and Grill in this little section that goes through a city park. And right now, Cornelia Marine St. Croix Watershed District and the city are kind of in the process of envisioning what that should look like when that stream gets restored. So lots of exciting restoration work happening on the streams, but also a lot of work going into restoring and protecting our lakes. So obviously we like our lakes a lot. I recommended just a few cool lakes to visit, either because they're relatively close to the Twin Cities and very nice lakes to go swimming and fishing at, or because they're, a special lake, the head of the St. Croix River, the head of the Namakagon River. But we've also got some pretty exciting success stories to celebrate together. In 2022, in Washington County, we actually had 7 lakes get delisted. These are lakes that were considered impaired for a variety of reasons, usually because of having too much phosphorus. And the local watershed districts and communities have spent a long time working to get these lakes taken off of the impaired waters list. So you can see 5 of them here on this slide. One that was kind of near and dear to my heart was Lily Lake in Stillwater. And the Friends of Lily Lake, the people who live around, have actually been working on restoring this lake for more than 20 years. So it has been more than 2 decades of studies and collaboration and citizen engagement and grant writing, just all this work. And we had a delisting celebration in 2022. And what these 2 girls are the daughters of Matt Oldenburg Downing, who is the administrator for the Middle St. Croix Watershed Management Organization. And what we are doing is we are burning the impairment listing to celebrate the fact that the lake was finally meeting water quality standards. But we didn't stop there. So 2024, more delistings happened. So you can see here some more of those lakes that were delisted just this last summer. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency reviews its impaired waters list every 2 years. So it will be next year before we find out if we get to take any more off of the impaired waters list. But like I said, it's been a lot of work and a lot of community engagement, people planting rain gardens, people adopting storm drains, people who are getting out there and taking care of the rain gardens once they get planted, big projects, grants, just a lot of effort all around, but success stories to celebrate as well. Okay, so I am going to read one last excerpt from the book, and then maybe I'll just kind of stop and take questions and have a conversation with you all. But I thought this is always one of my favorite ones to share. And it is called Lessons from a Garden. Sometimes you think you have a really good idea, like planting vegetable gardens at your office. Full of enthusiasm, you put your family to work and spend an entire day tearing out sod, piecing together scrap lumber, and hauling in dirt. It is hard work, but you feel proud. Then it is the next year, and you think it will be easier, but it's not. This time it's only you, your kid, and the dog. Last year's dirt is rock hard and full of weeds. You dig, you hammer, you sweat. There's a truck full of new soil to unload and only a 6-year-old to help. But he does. He rakes the rich black dirt smooth while you shovel and haul one wheelbarrow after another. Shovel, haul, shovel. Finally, it is time to plant. That part, the long-awaited planting, is finished so surprisingly quickly. By then, the sun is set, you're covered in dirt, and the dog has ticks, but at last, the garden is planted. You can learn many things from a garden. One is that few things worth doing in life happen easily or quickly. Whether you're training for a race, raising a child, or trying to restore the St. Croix River, it can take months, years, or even a lifetime of hard work and relentless forward motion to succeed. In the example of a race, there's at least an endpoint at which your work is done and the long-sought goal accomplished. Like most other things in life, however, the garden is never finished. The garden is an endless cycle of hoeing and planting, weeding and tending, preserving before the winter and then starting over in the spring. Planting seeds and harvesting tomatoes are the shortest, sweetest tasks in a never-ending, though worthwhile and satisfying job. Gardening also shows us how hard it is to transform the earth from one thing into another. In the still of the night, while the freshly raked soil lies smooth and brown, the weeds have already begun to creep in and take over. Maple seed helicopters spiral to the ground, ready to reclaim the garden as a forest. As the summer progresses, the edging cracks and the hand-painted markers fade. To preserve the garden requires constant tending. Even when we aim to turn the process in reverse, changing farm field back to prairie or restoring a degraded lake, nature seems to fight the transformation. The larger the garden, the harder the job becomes. The St. Croix River Basin is 7,760 square miles. That's nearly 5 million acres of land to tend. In 2004, the St. Croix Basin team set a goal of reducing phosphorus flowing into the river by 20% in order to reduce algae blooms and restore the river to good health. Today, the gardeners work hoeing and weeding, planting and tending. They plant rain gardens in cities and buffers on stream banks and farm fields. The garden teaches us two final lessons. The first is that many hands make the workload lighter. One person can plant a garden, though it's hard and bitter work, but one person can't restore a river, and neither can one agency or one organization. When everyone works together, the impossible becomes realistic. Finally, the garden teaches us to teach and involve our youth. Those kids will amaze you with what they can already do, planting trees, weeding rain gardens, stenciling storm drains, and planning events. They burst in with new ideas and enthusiasm, ready to help us tend the garden, not just in the future, but also today. If you show them, they'll learn how to sow the seeds and nurture the plants, and equally important, the garden will teach you how to trust the child and hand him a rake and a shovel. Okay, so here is the moment. Here is the moment where I don't suppose there's any reason for me to stop sharing hi or stop sharing hey if I can't see people. I was thinking, oh, I'll stop sharing, then I can see all your faces. I'm still not going to be able to see your faces.
Well, then they can see yours, and it's your choice.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll do that.
And I see mine. Okay, so first question we have, and just a reminder to people, if you have a question for Angie, put it in the Q&A. Chat we're going to use now for like links or things like that. And like I'm going to be throwing a link into answer for this very first question: how to learn of gatherings in the watershed if you're not on social media.
Gatherings. Okay. So some of the organizations that are most active in the St. Croix watershed, there is the Wild Rivers Conservancy of the St. Croix and Namakagon, and they are the friends group for the St. Croix National Scenic Riverway. They organize a lot of stewardship activities, and then they also have, volunteer trainings and fundraising kind of events. So Wild Rivers Conservancy, I'll just type that in the chat. Oops. Wild was supposed to be the word. I left my D off of my wild. There is North Woods and Waters of the St. Croix Heritage area is an initiative underway to get the St. Croix designated as a National Heritage Area. And they have a monthly kind of like speaker series that's online, and they also have in-person events that they hold. So those two organizations, but then one last thing would be, let's see, St. Croix 360. Greg Seitz manages it's basically like a blog style news site. He sends out an e-newsletter once a week, and then articles get posted there. And it's a lot of like news and current events, but there's usually also an events list that's down at the bottom of that email.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay, and let's see, a couple of questions that got put into chat before I made
Yeah.
my little announcement. Is Big Spring Falls and Sandstone Rapids on Kettle River part of the watershed?
Yep. So Kettle River is in the watershed. Snake River is also in the watershed. So all of the everything in those rivers is going to the St. Croix eventually.
Right, and people don't realize that, the city's everything in between is all part of the watershed because.
Yep, exactly. Yep. Every time it rains, everything that lands on the land, it's going somewhere. It's either soaking into the ground and going into the aquifers, or it's running off and it's going into one of those lakes and streams. And so it is, all part of the watershed.
Yeah, which is why rain gardens and all of that are so important to that. Okay. Someone says Bellwin Conservancy has a great series of programs and they seek volunteers to support and assist with programs.
Yep.
So
yeah, they're really great. And I mean, there's so many good nonprofits that are actively working in the area. It's kind of hard to think of them all. And it's part of the reason that I like the St. Croix watershed so much, because of course you do have the state parks and the state forests, but then there's all this public land that's managed by nonprofits. You've got Carpenter Nature Center, the Bellwin Conservancy, even places like Franconia Sculpture Park, they also have restored prairie on their property. And so, all these different and unique ways of connecting with the land and kind of community of volunteers and people that go to those places. Yeah.
Okay. More questions, people. Also, okay, I'm just going to mention a class that's coming up in spring that just because I know birding is such a huge thing that you can do in all of this. And there is a spring class beyond the bird feeder so birding's a lifelong pleasure. And it's just kind of one of those things where educate yourself and then drive out into these things. And also, like you said, just, doing the different things. You can drive, you can canoe, you can bike and visit and see, like you said, so many different birds that you haven't even realized are just migrating through by the thousands. So, okay. Are you concerned about the Trump administration rolling back all the progress that's been made?
Yes. I mean, I know as a local government employee, I'm usually supposed to take a nonpartisan response, but yeah, I mean, I am. We're lucky in the program that I run is entirely locally funded by cities and counties and watershed districts in the area. However, everything that we do is ultimately underpinned by the Clean Water Act. And, the reason that the cities fund a program to educate the public about stormwater is because there is a Clean Water Act, which delegates authority to the states, and then the states require the cities to do stormwater pollution prevention and education. And so even in places where we have funding coming from the state and local level, it's all interwoven together that, the state and local programs would really be, it's hard to imagine what might happen if that federal legislation and oversight weren't there to keep them going. There was a question about electricity generated by the water, and I think that's probably in regard to the dams. And that is one of the considerations that like the Army Corps is looking at in particular for the Ford Dam, that they're running the calculus of, what's the benefit and what's the financial benefit and electricity that's generated versus the cost to maintain. Because as we've seen this past year when we had that dramatic dam blowout, dams don't last forever. So the dams do have to be maintained, and there's not a scenario in which we don't spend any money and we just let the dams sit there. We either have to invest in fixing them or invest in taking them down. And so I actually cannot predict what the Army Corps is going to decide, if they're going to recommend keeping them or getting rid of them. But that is definitely part of the calculus that they're looking into.
And who knows what funding they'll have. So,
yeah.
Which is also a thing. Before I go to about your book again, will you discuss the risks of PFAS in the water on the east side?
Yeah, I can do that. I know I'm always like, aha, like if it weren't for you kids, I would have gotten away with it. Okay, I will show that screen in a moment, but or I guess I could show it while I'm talking, and then
Yeah, that works.
People need to write it down, they can. Yeah, it's merely because PFAS is, I think, literally my least favorite topic to talk about when I'm talking about water. So we have a pretty big PFAS problem in our groundwater and now in our surface water. And it is an epicenter is kind of in the East Metro area, though PFAS is found, is being found all around the state, but just not in the concentrations it's found here. So historically, what happened is that back in the 1950s and 60s, when 3M was manufacturing products like Scotchgard and Teflon, firefighting foam, and disposing of the chemicals used to make that, those chemicals eventually leached down into our groundwater. And at the time that all of that was disposed of, it was done so in a way, that was considered to be legal at the time. So some of it was disposed of on site. 3M owns land in Oakdale and then on the border of Cottage Grove and Woodbury. And then some was disposed of at a Washington County landfill that's in Lake Elmo. Long since closed. The landfill was only open for a couple of years in the 70s. So anyway, disposed of back in the 50s and 60s, decades ago. And then fast forward 2002, the Pollution Control Agency discovered that there was PFAS in the groundwater in Lake Elmo and in Oakdale. And so initially it was thought that this was the only place where the problem was. And in 2006, the city of Oakdale, they built a big water treatment plant. People who were in Lake Elmo that were on private wells got connected to city water supplies. And a lot of work went into making sure that people would get clean drinking water. So from about 2006 until 2016, there was like a 10-year stretch of time when I was at my job, and we would get periodic updates. They were monitoring the spread of the PFAS plume in the groundwater, and it was slowly progressing southward and eastward. And then it suddenly leaped and got a lot further towards the St. Croix River than people expected, because the groundwater and the surface water don't actually stay separate. We have spring-fed streams, we have spring-fed lakes, we have places where the water goes down into the ground. And so what happened was the water got up into a creek, Raleigh Creek, and it migrated really far east very quickly. And then there's places also where there was a flood prevention project at Lake Elmo Regional Park, and piping that goes under the park and ends up at a lake on the other side of the park. And so the PFAS was able to migrate through there as well. So now we have, as of 2021, they found it in the St. Croix River for the first time. And as a result, it's now considered impaired for having PFAS. And there's a couple of lakes in the area where we know it is. In terms of people's safety and their drinking water, all of the communities that are impacted in Southern Washington County have taken steps to make sure people have clean drinking water. So if people are in private wells, they're either getting carbon, charcoal, granulated active carbon filters, so they have clean drinking water at their home, or in the municipal wells, they've built treatment centers in like Cottage Grove, Woodbury, Oakdale, or in some places they've shut down, a well if it was found to have too high of levels of PFAS. So it's safe to drink the water. Like, I don't want anybody to feel like it's not safe to drink the water. But the reason I hate talking about it is because there's not really anything we can do about it. It's not like, I love giving people talks about rain gardens because it's like, we got a problem, we're going to build a rain garden, we're going to fix the problem, you can do it, let's all come together. And with PFAS, it's not one of those situations. Like, we just, at the moment, literally do not know, we don't have the knowledge or the technology to know what to do about it. It's down there in the aquifers. There's not like a magic solution. And so we're just kind of stuck with this problem for the foreseeable future. And they call them forever chemicals because they take so long to break down. And so we're stuck with this problem for a very long time.
Okay. Somebody is saying, do you have information about your programs you run?
Yeah. So most of the programs that I run are listed on the Washington Conservation District website. There we go. And so upcoming workshops about like, planting for pollinators or becoming a tree steward, things like that are all listed on that website.
Okay, and somebody put something in, let's see. Amen to canoeing. We have put in on the Wisconsin side, straight east from Square Lake over on the Wisconsin side. It's wild, lots of birds. Hard to find the put in, down a dirt road, need better maps.
Yep.
And that's one of those things about the campsites that you're saying. Are those easily found, the free campsites? Easily found on a map, or?
I mean, you are going to need to use your good eyes. But yes, I mean, they're marked in the map. The maps that you go to the National Park Service website for the St. Croix Riverway. You can download the maps. They're not topographic maps. They're not at like the super high quality scale. But it is a river and you're going one direction. It's not so much like it is when you're in the boundary waters and you can get yourself going the totally wrong direction down a lake. I mean, you're basically flowing down river. And the only danger is if you're in one of those sections where there's islands, you have to make sure that you stay on the correct side of the island if you're coming up on a campsite you're looking for. But they're usually pretty easy to spot as long as you're looking for them. They'll have, a nice little visible triangle sign that you can see from the water. But yeah, it's a wild experience. So it's definitely one that you have to plan ahead. I do have information in the book. Somebody was, asking about like the physical book. It's kind of a combination of a guidebook, a how-to, and stories. So there's stories in here, but there's also a section at the back about, safety and, kind of building your skills for doing outdoor stuff and maps of, recommended places to go with information about like, they're coded like this one is a beginner destination. If you want to see the prairie and you still want to have a bathroom and a paved parking lot to park in, go to Afton State Park or go to Bellman Conservancy. Versus if you are hardcore and you really want to get out there and have this wilderness experience, well, sure, go up on the Northern Riverway, but make sure you plan ahead and understand that there probably won't be cell coverage. So you're not just going to be able to call and get a ride home if you hit a rainstorm.
Yes. Different doing it in your 20s to doing it in your 60s.
Yeah.
But otherwise, we're still have plenty of time for questions.
Okay.
I mean, you can tell my eyesight's going a little bit here because I'm like, what time is it? Okay, it's 3:38. Plenty of time for people to pipe in, or you can share more on anything. Let's see, anything. I'm nice and broad there.
Anything, I know.
So, okay, let's see. Try to scroll back through here in case I missed anything. Yeah, somebody asked, where are sandbar boat party people? I want to avoid them.
Yeah. They're pretty much all on the lower river, and they're in that stretch that's between the High Bridge and Stillwater. So if I am going on the river and I'm going on a canoe, kayak, paddleboard, which is the only way I go in the river, I always stay north of the High Bridge for that reason. Because I also like to avoid the party boats and the motor boats. Having said that, though, every once in a while I'll be in my bonnet and I will put in Marine and St. Croix and go down to the boom site. And the boom site is just a little ways south of the High Bridge because it is such a cool stretch of river. I mean, just beautiful sandbars, and you just lie there. Oh my gosh, it's like you're having this wilderness beach all to yourself, just lying there in the river. And it's kind of cool. You go under the High Bridge, it's just this enormous soaring railroad bridge. When we went under it last time, my son and I, some person had climbed up and tied a rope up to the top. So there was just this enormous rope swing, which I never would have put up there myself, but I sure will swing from it if I find it. So it's a fun stretch of river to explore, but then you do get stuck with that one little bit, south of the High Bridge until you get to the boom site where they're starting to be big boats, and so that part is kind of a pain at the end if you're on a paddle craft.
Okay, one thing I was thinking of, I know you deal with all the different seasons in your book, and since we're still in winter, do you have any winter recommendations of things to do right now?
Yeah, I do. Oh, and I might even have a slide or something that I can share. The bridge that I'm calling the High Bridge is the Arcola crossing. It's a railroad bridge. And let's see if I'm probably not going to be able to do it without having to force you all to see pictures of flowers in the process. Oh no, don't make us look. No. We are coming up in spring, so as long as I'm showing you pictures of flowers, we'll mention that one of the first signs of spring I always look for are when the skunk cabbage and the marsh marigold start coming up in the seepage wetlands along the St. Croix River. So that's always one very hopeful sign of spring. And then a little bit later than that is when those spring ephemerals start coming out. Sunfish Lake Park and Lake Delmo is a good place to look for those. But let me get out of this view and I'll get myself into this view so I can. Okay, so it's still showing. Okay. So yeah, obviously lots of fun things to do in the winter time. And skiing is an obvious one that comes to mind right away. There are a lot of really nice cross-country ski trails in the state parks and in the regional parks. I also have a pair of snowshoes. So these are my feet you're looking at with these red snowshoes on them. You have probably seen some of those really big wooden kinds that people use when they're going in deep snow, like up north or in Alaska. But around here, where we tend to have shallower snow and lots of logs and hills and things like that, it's a little bit easier to use these small ones. These are called modified bear claws, and they've got little kind of grippy claws on the bottom. So I find it nice if I'm walking on, it's not really a trail. I'm walking in the woods and there's hills and whatnot, and, to keep from slipping. And just makes it a little bit easier to avoid sinking in. But one of the fun parts about snowshoes is that you can go to all sorts of places during the winter that you would never be able to access during the summer when there's open water. You could go tromping through wetlands, and you can walk across the river. I've done that before. I've walked across the river from Minnesota to Wisconsin. You have to be pretty careful just to make sure that you're not going into a place where there's thin ice or springs. But you can walk around on lakes and you don't need to stay on a trail is basically what I'm saying. I am not really that into fishing, but my son sure as heck is. He absolutely is obsessed with fishing. And wintertime is a great time to go fishing too. So ice fishing is another one of those popular activities that people do during the wintertime. I think that it just happened last week But Hudson has an annual hot air affair. It's a hot air balloon festival that they do every year in the beginning of February. And that's, a fun thing. It's, you're not having to tromp out into the wilderness. You just go and get to see all the colorful hot air balloons take off. But yeah, that's something else that's kind of
Okay.
fun.
If people are looking for snowshoes, I know that we have, I think, 3 or 4 branches here at the Suburban Ramsey County Libraries that have
Nice.
snowshoes that you can
Okay,
check
so you
out.
loan them out to people. That's great.
Yes, so
Yeah.
adults and children. So
That's great.
if in case you want to go tramping around somewhere.
Yep.
Let's see, what else do we have? Can you explain more about how phosphorus gets into the rivers and how they get restored?
Sure. So it really depends a lot on, are we talking rivers? Are we talking lakes and what the landscape is? So in urban areas, most of the phosphorus is coming from stormwater runoff. It is either coming from sediment when dirt is eroding and, washing off of the landscape, or it's coming from organic matter like leaves and grass clippings. We've had a phosphorus-free fertilizer law in Minnesota since 2005. So in urban areas, it is not usually coming from fertilizer. It's coming from natural things. But the way we get rid of it is that we find ways to have the stormwater soak into the ground or get filtered before it goes to lakes. So if you see stormwater ponds, that is one way that we capture stormwater and hold it and help to get some of the phosphorus and other contaminants out of it. If you're looking at a rain garden, that's a way of soaking the water into the ground. So then it gets naturally cleaned by the plant's roots and by the soil, and then the groundwater will eventually make its way to lakes and streams. When we get out into the country, then it's much more often coming from, farm fields. And so very much like in an urban area, a lot of that phosphorus is coming from the sediment, not directly from fertilizer. But there is sometimes coming from fertilizer as well, or it is in poop. It's in poop. So it comes both from people poop and animal poop, but leaking septic systems as well as farms that have a lot of manure. Those can all be sources of the phosphorus. And so like, as you kind of keep scaling up how big the watershed is, you think of an urban lake and it's a relatively small area that's all draining to the lake. But if you're thinking about the St. Croix River, and like I said, that's almost 8,000 square miles of land. It's a lot of different stuff that's going into the water. Probably 75% in the St. Croix River is coming from rural agricultural areas, and not nearly as much is coming from the urbanized areas. So that is challenging in that we don't really have rules that we can force farmers to farm differently. There is a buffer law in Minnesota that was enacted about 8 years ago or so. And so farms are required to maintain buffers of, unmowed vegetation along the edges of lakes, streams, and public ditches. But, there's not a ton of rules regarding farming. We have been fairly successful in getting farmers to engage with us through voluntary programs. And so in the past 5 years or so, we've had a lot of additional funding in the lower St. Croix, Minnesota side at least, where we've been working with farmers to put in cover crops. So the land is covered during the wintertime, and we would love for people to be, working more and experimenting more with perennial crops. But at the moment, a lot of these farms are kind of doing a corn and soybean rotation. So the cover crops, minimal tillage, putting in sediment basins, those are our main strategies that we're able to get in the farming areas.
Okay. Someone's wondering if you could talk about, do you know about the cabins at Wild River for glampers versus campers?
I don't know if I know the details on them off the top of my head. Is the question, are there cabins there, or is the
They're
question?
going, mention the cabins at Wild River for glampers. And I'm like,
Okay.
okay.
I don't know anything about the Wild River cabins, but my mouse just died here, it looks like. Okay. I've just been having bad luck with mice this week. This is the second mouse I've been on. Yeah, I don't know the details about the cabins, but there are cabins there. And there are even, like, at Afton State Park, they have yurts. You can, if you want to go
I've-
glamping, you can rent yourself a yurt. So a lot of the parks do have glamping options also, which is nice.
yeah, well, go to the Minnesota DNR website to look at the state parks.
Yep.
All the information should be there. And let me see if I can pull up a link for that. And let's see. I'll post that in chat. So, and because yeah, that talks to you about rental and what's available, how many people fit, what the amenities are. So, okay. So there, you can check out that link, and in case, like we said, you want to have a little bit more comfort than
Mm-hmm.
the riverside that maybe has a throne out in the woods.
Yep, exactly. Well, and I mean, to be perfectly honest, I spend so much time in the St. Croix watershed on all these, hiking trails, and have these very wild experiences that I just do as day trips, because it's close enough that you can.
Right.
And so, I might go, like just this Sunday, my son and I went over to Standing Cedars Conservancy by Osceola, and we snowshoed in, and there's a little spring-fed stream, and there was a whole bunch of watercress growing in it. And so we harvested a whole bunch of watercress. It's a non-native species here. And so we harvested a whole bunch of watercress, and we went down and, just kind of hung out for a while and then came home again. And you can do that. You can just come out for the day and go back to your own home, or, there's plenty of bed and breakfasts and VRBOs and hotels and stuff. So it is neat that way, because it's not so much like when you go up north to Boundary Waters, Voyageurs, and you really have to commit to, being there and camping. You can kind of dabble in the wilderness in the St. Croix. And I think it's part of what makes the watershed so nice, is that you have all these little towns that have, arts and culture and little drive-in diners and places like that to stop it along the way. So it doesn't have to be so hardcore. Yeah.
Okay. If somebody's wondering if are a lot of these places dog friendly, like
A lot of them are, yeah.
or
And I tried to, in the book, mention, it's important to me because I have a dog and I like to take my dog with me. The scientific natural areas do not allow dogs. So that's one of the few places featured in the book that aren't allowing dogs, but most of the places allow dogs. Most of them require dogs that are unleashed, but there's a few that don't. Like at Standing Cedars, you probably saw, I've got photos of my dogs off leash, because they're actually allowed to be off leash there as long as it's not during the ground bird nesting season. So yeah, and Bellwin Conservancy, they have like their Stagecoach Prairie trails you're allowed to have dogs at. So sometimes in some of the places there's like one set of trails you can't and one set that you can, but yeah.
So always good to know in case you want to do a day trip with your dog. So,
Exactly.
Okay, well, we have about 7 more minutes in case people want to ask anything else or you want to share anything else. So, yeah, I was thinking winter, and now we talked about spring a little, those flowers to look for. If people want to be planting any pollinator things, is there anything that they should be starting now towards
So I mean, there's not really much you can do.
I'm just like, I'm just gonna ask just because
Yeah, you
don't know.
can start dreaming, you can start scheming. I know that I'm going to be leading a couple of Planting for Pollinators webinars in March and in April. I've got one on March 11th and April 3rd, I think, are the 2 evenings that we're doing Planting for Pollinator webinars. So you can start scheming. Like in Washington County, the Conservation District does site visits, but we don't start doing those until late April, once the snow is melted. You can't really start planting anything until you get to mid-May. So, and unlike with vegetables, native plants aren't the kind of thing that you don't start it inside and start a little seed tray before
Yeah.
you put them outside. In fact, you would not want to do that. You know, the
Yeah.
native plant seeds have to get cold and cold stratify and all that jazz. So now is a time for dreaming and scheming, basically, and waiting.
And visit places like we have 2 libraries that have seed
Oh,
libraries. So visit and find out if they have seeds that are something you can plant for that.
yeah.
Because I know like we've done like milkweed seeds and stuff like that that we've had before, and like encouraging people to take those and plant. Okay, somebody's talking about the electricity is generated by water, and that was we talked about that with the dam
Yep, yep.
in
I
terms
think I
of,
was addressing that question earlier.
yeah.
Um, I was just going to mention on the topic of plants and seeds also. I don't know if they have it on their website, but Blue Thumb, Planting for Clean Water. They have a really great website all about, you know, how to plant a native garden, where to find your seeds, classes to get started. But they had just posted on their Facebook page last week a whole list of all of the native plant sales coming up in the Twin Cities. So you can mark your calendar for whatever one is closest to where you live.
So, okay. Yeah, well, we're hitting the end of the time. So if you just want to, I don't know if you have any final things to say before we wrap up here. Um,
I don't know.
I know it's like there's
I
so
think,
much, and
yep. There's reasons to be hopeful. There's reasons to be frightened. There's a lot of good people and a lot of good organizations that are working really hard. I know I meet so many people who, you know, feel like they're the only one that care. And, you know, you're not if you feel that way. There's so many people who care. And, you know, so many people who I meet in outreach and community work that we do that, you know, are they're planting native gardens and they're volunteering, and you know we are making change, and a lot of times that change is happening at a local level. So yeah, and don't forget to get out there and enjoy it. You know, it's
right.
equally important to get out there and enjoy the places, even those ones that are close to home. Yeah.
Yeah. So just keep advocating for this stuff if you're listening. That's what's important, is for us to keep advocating that this continues, and that we can enjoy these things, because that's truly a part of why we live here, I think, in Minnesota. And yeah, and it's great to hear. I mean, we always hear so much about the Mississippi, so that's why I was excited when you came out with this, because it's um, such a huge part of where
Yeah.
we're at too. So
Yeah. Well, and we're so lucky because the St. Croix, you know, I mentioned that there's a couple hundred rivers in the wild and scenic river system, and the St. Croix is the only one that's close to a major metropolitan area. So we really have it so lucky that, you know, we can have this wilderness experience only an hour away from home. So yeah, pretty cool.
okay, well,
Okay.
we're nearing the end of our time, and I just want to thank you, Angie, for
Yeah.
just sharing the breadth of your knowledge with us. And like we said, people, I'm hoping you've clicked on those links in chat. Get them into your browser history so that you can refer back to them. So giving you a minute or two here to do that while I talk.
Mhm.
And just a reminder that next week, our Wednesday with the Scholar is going to be saving the Dakota language. We have I'm gonna say it's Joe, but he has his Dakota language name that I know I would butcher at this point, so I'm not gonna try and say that. We'll say it next week. But that's gonna be a really interesting thing to learn about next week. And as I said, thank you so much for sharing with us. It's been an entertaining hour and a half. So much to have taken in and learn. And as I said, this is recorded. It will eventually, in the next week or two, be up on the Ollie YouTube channel and the library's website. So once again, thank you, Angie. Thank you all for participating today. Tons of comments and questions. Thank you for that. And everyone, have a good day. Things are going to be a little warmer by this weekend. So
All
enjoy.
right. Thanks, Kay.
Yeah.